The idea of perpetuation of my consciousness, of my presence, and of a created self for eternity or for an enormous long duration interests me greatly. More than interests me, it excites me. And I think it's what I'm involved in, even as an artist, even with the very primitive, as it were, technologies that we have at the moment. Because I think the maintenance of the body as it is not a terribly interesting idea. But the idea of creation of one's own body, that in other words, rather than being landed with something, whatever, which is, one could actually be involved in the creation of one's own identity, one's physical identity, as well as one's spiritual, one's intellectual identity. That I find extremely interesting. And I think that may be that next sort of leap in evolution in many ways that we're talking about. And that I would understand to be an important consequence of artificial life research. It's not so much maintaining the body in a frozen state and bringing it back to life. That doesn't interest me whatsoever. But the idea of recreating, and perhaps endlessly recreating, my presence, which is to say my body, but that's going to be largely a bionic body, as in fact it is now. I can't live without telephone, fax machine, many sorts of attributes. And if I am, quote, ill, if I'm not whole, then I will use technology to make another heart, to give me an artificial leg. Of course, we all do this. So we are already cyborgs. But what is interesting about a cyborg is not that it would remain in perpetuity in its form, but that it has the possibility to constantly renew itself, recreate itself, reconstruct itself, if you like, indefinitely. That excites me, and that's my reading of immortality.
Aber er will doch wohl kein Cyborg sein.
But you don't want to be a cyborg?
We are cyborgs. We are all cyborgs. A cyborg is simply an individual who can only function as human beings, we never have been objects. We have always been, or we can always see ourselves as having been immensely complex subsystems of larger subsystems of larger subsystems, ultimately on one level, the solar system, for example. So in that sense, we have a symbiotic relationship, of course, with the environment, of which we are a subsystem in various ways. Now, if that environment is predominantly, or anyway, to a very great extent, technologically determined and technologically defined and structured, then inevitably our relationship with it, our subsystem of that larger system, has to be and is bionic. Is bionic. We use not just prostheses in methods of the transformation of the environment by building, by producing, by transforming environment, but our means of communication are prosthetic. We no longer use the human voice alone to make proclamations and we certainly no longer use our eyes to see the world. In fact, we now, whereas 300 years ago we had a saying that we still have in common use, seeing is believing, now we know that that is absolutely not the case, that what we see is not the case. The surface, the mirror, lies. The surface is not the truth. And we have prostheses, prosthetic systems, that allow us to see all the complexities of which the surface of whatever is simply a part. So we are cyborgs in that sense. We are indissolubly cyborgs within that sense. Otherwise we wouldn't function within the environment that we're in. So in that sense we are cyborgs, but a consequence of this relationship we have with a technologically determined environment is such that we are at the point, certainly with the technologies of telepresence, of virtual reality, for example, and perhaps ultimately with the technologies of genetic engineering things of that kind, we are at that point where we can seriously consider reconstructing ourselves. I mean, we certainly do now, of course. I mean, we have done for many centuries with the wheel and so forth. But with electrical systems and with optical systems and with biological systems, which are artificial systems, we can seriously think about restructuring ourselves. Now, once we do that, once we enter into that sort of relationship with ourselves, so to speak, of renewal and reconstruction, the process can be indefinite. The process goes on. One reconstruction leads to another reconstruction, leads to another reconstruction. That is what I take to be immortality.